Thought for this video we'd do something a little bit different. I'm going to intersperse doing some GUI programming along with learning more stuff about objects in Python. Now, there's a whole discussion here about what tool one chooses to use GUI programming, to do GUI programming. I've chosen to use Tkinter as the tool to teach you guys, because it's built in, it's simple to use. The downside is that Tkinter looks a little antiquated. It doesn't have sort of the modern, up-to-date, cool stuff to go with it. So there are other ways to do GUI programming using Python, which you can go ahead and read about, but we're going to use this because it is simple and built in. You don't have to mess about a whole bunch to get it to work. And there are tons of online discussions about which tool is better. You can also, welcome to go read about that. There's you could use Qt and other things like this. But like I said, we're just going to go with Tkinter to keep it simple. So we're going to import Tkinter in, and I'm going to call it TK. And then if you want to create just a simple window, the easiest thing to do is to create a TK object. And I'm going to call it root. So this is going to be the root of our main window. And then to actually get that window up, we have to call main loop. So main loop is just going to sit there and run while that window is open until a user closes the window. So if we run this, we're going to get a simple window. It doesn't have anything in it. There's no file menus or anything like that. It's just a window that has a minimize, maximize, and close button. And that's it. That's all you get. So to put anything else in here, we would have to create that. But I can close it. And that's part of the root.main loop here. When I hit this X, this knows to close that window. I can reposition the window and resize it if I want to. Whoops, come back here. So that kind of thing is all stuff that comes with having a window open in a GUI interface. And that's all stuff that's built into these two lines of code. Okay, so that's not that exciting. What if we wanted to add a little bit of something to that? So I'm going to add to my main window a label. So to do that, you simply call label. I have to prefix it with a TK because this is a method inside of Tkinter. I'm going to put this label in the root main window. So the first thing we specify here is where we're going to place it. And then here is what the text is going to say. It's just going to say hello world. Now, if I just do that, I'm going to take this last bit out. If I just create this label and run main loop, then there's no label here. So what we have to do is not only create the label, but we have to place that label inside the window somehow. And it turns out there are 3 different ways to do that. So you can go read about those other ones too, because the only ones I'm going to cover in my videos is grid. There's another method that's maybe supposedly easier to use called pack. I'm not particularly fond of it. Grid gives a lot, I think, more control and isn't hard to learn. So I'm just saying, for this simple window, I want to place a label in it. I'm just going to put it in row 0, column 0, and then Tkinter will go ahead and break the window up into different rows and columns. In this case, it's going to recognize that we only have one. This is called a widget. We only have one widget going into the window, so it's only going to need one row and one column, and then it will just go ahead and place it in there for us. So we're going to go ahead and place our label, and we now have created our first hello world program. One other thing to note about doing this, when you do this placement, the return value for all of this is not what you might hope it would be. When it places this, you basically get a yes I placed or a no I didn't place it. You don't get back useful information. So when you put the .grid on the end of this, you don't want to assign this to a variable. But that's something we'll get into more in the future. So I probably shouldn't have even mentioned that now. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about this grid geometry then with the rows and columns. I'm going to place more stuff into my window. So again, we're starting off with a root window. and I'm going to put a bunch of different labels in here. I'm going to have a label with just the number 1, just the number 2, just the number 3, the word 4, and the number 5. We have 2 rows. Row 0 was always the first row, and row 1 is always the next row. I actually could put row 2 here, and it wouldn't put a blank row in. It's going to use the next available row. And we're going to have 3 columns, 0, 1, and 2. And let's see what this thing looks like when we run it. So I'm going to run grid geometry. I want to move this thing. It's so small. It's gonna, yeah. Okay, so this is row 0, column 1, row 0, column 0, row 0, column 1 is here. Notice that the spacing here is spaced enough for this, and then row 0, column 2, which is where we've placed the 2. And then the 3 is in row 1, column 0. The word 4 is in row 1, column 1. And the numeral 5 is in row 1, column 2. So notice that when you do this grid geometry manager, it recognizes that this middle column needs to be wide enough to accommodate the 4 and spaces that entire column the appropriate amount. Now, what I was saying before is it also recognizes how many total rows it's going to need and how many total columns it's going to need, and handles that accordingly. So I could try to put a blank row in here, but without actually putting something into a row 1, it's not going to do anything. This looks exactly the same. So if I wanted to have a blank row in here, I'd actually have to create a row of blanks. Let's do this. Put those back. Okay, so now we know how to make text labels and perhaps position them in our window. Let's look at something a little bit more advanced. You can break your window up into what are known as frames, and the frames can be used to not only how you think about the window and how it's designed, but it also can be used to, well, literally frame your window. So I'm going to have 2 frames, a left frame and a right frame. And this left frame is just going to be a simple way of thinking about it. I'm just thinking that I have 2 different frames, so I split the window in 2. But the right frame has a little bit more. It's going to have a border around it. The width of that border will be 2. The background color is going to be red, and it's going to be sunken. So there's a bunch of different attributes one can put in here for relief. You can have sunken, you can have flat, raised. So let's take a look. Well, now I'm going to place those 2 frames. I want this to be on the left and this to be on the right. So I'm going to change the columns. They're both going to be in row 0. So it turns out then, the way I'm doing this, that the main root window is only going to have 1 row in it. And in that row, there's going to be 2 frames. Then inside the frames, I'm going to create more rows. But the geometry inside the frames is relative to the frame, not the outside window. So we'll talk about that again some more. But I'm going to place them both in row 0. The left frame is going to be in column 1, and the right frame is going to be in column 0, or the first column, and this will be in column 1, the second column. And then this thing right here, the sticky equals n, means that I want this left frame to be all the way at the top. And we're going to come back and modify that once we actually run this program. Now I'm going to place a bunch of labels inside the left frame, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again. I'm going to change this label so that it's colored blue and is in the Cambria font with size 16. And that's the placing on these is exactly the same as I did before in the grid geometry manager. And now I'm going to come down, I'm going to create the right frame and do something very similar, but in this case I'm going to have the background be red. And notice that these placements are relative to the frame that I'm creating. So now I'm placing the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 relative to the right frame. Let's just go ahead and run this and see what this thing looks like. Okay, so this looks very similar to what we had before when I ran grid geometry. except for where I changed the font size and the color of the font for this one, but the placement is all the same. But notice that when I'm doing this row 0, row 1, column 0, column 1, column 2 stuff here, that's inside of this frame. So you think of this thing as its own window, this frame. And then over here in right frame, remember that the background is red. And then I'm adding in these labels. And when you add in the labels, the label also has its own background color, and the default is going to be a gray. So notice that for some of these labels, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5, the background is changed back to gray, while the rest of the window is in red. Notice that it has a border around it, and that it looks sunken. It would look more sunken if I get rid of this background business. So we can do that and rerun it. Oops. Okay, so now you can see that it looks sunken. It's easier to see when it doesn't have a color on it. And then we've made this frame have the background be red. And again, this placement, so this is in row 0, column 0 of this frame. And then this frame has 4 rows, 0, 1, 2, and 3. So these rows, I guess I keep saying the same thing over and over again. These rows and columns are not relative to the original root. So this frame has 4 rows, 2 columns. And again, the column spacing here is set so that there's enough room in this column for the word 4 in there. Okay, so what you should get out of this is how to create then a window. So at the very basic, you have to have this to create a window and this to actually have the window pop up and keep running until somebody closes it, clicking an X. You can break that window up into a bunch of different frames if you want to, and those frames can have different looks. There's a lot of ways to modify how the frames look. I'm going to suggest that if you want to read more about this, I mean, you have a book too, but there's a website, fbot.com. I'm not sure where that comes from, but it has a really nice Tkinter coverage in there. So there's tons of options for every one of these things. I'm only going over the basics, but there are a ton of options in here that I'm not hitting, and I'm not doing that on purpose. We could spend an entire semester easily just talking about different options for Tkinter widgets. Okay, so you can break, getting back on track, you can break your window up into a bunch of different frames, and inside those frames, you can place the objects inside of there. Oh, the sticky equals north here. I forgot about that part. Let's run this again. So when I designed this window, I wanted this frame. I wanted all the stuff to be up at the top. But the way it does it by default is, even though I have row 0 here, row 0 isn't automatically at the top. It takes the entire, it looks at this, the dot grid geometry manager takes all the stuff and places it, and then thinks about it as a whole thing. So it thinks about this as being like an entire box. And unless I tell it otherwise, it'll take that entire box and center it and vertically and horizontally in this frame. And this frame has to be big enough to be the same size as this frame. So if I get rid of this, the sticky equals north, and you can have north, east, west, or south, or combinations of northeast, northwest, that kind of stuff. So this is now centered in vertically inside this frame, which is not the way I wanted it to look. So that's why I had the sticky equals north in there. And the grid will automatically do that. It will center things vertically and horizontally inside the frame unless you tell it to do otherwise. So the good news is we can create GUI programs, and the bad news is you really have to sit down and think about how you want this thing to look. So GUI program is going to be different from the programming that we've been doing, because there's a lot of things that you have to think about, and those things actually in some ways are separate. The first thing you have to do is, okay, I'm designing a window to accomplish task X. What does that window have to look like? So you have to get the layout down. Then and this is something we haven't gotten into yet, you also have actions that you have to take care of. So maybe I have a button in here that says click, and when that button's clicked, something has to happen. So we're going to have to learn how to deal with those actions, but that's going to come a little bit later. Anyways, at this point, hopefully you can create some windows and put some labels in there and create some frames and have them have a different appearance and that kind of thing. Feel free to read around on this stuff in your textbook or on the internet. Oops.